Here today for the interview is my longtime friend, my longtime colleague, and fellow Canadian, well, actually, fellow BCer, Tom Hierck. Really excited to have Tom on the podcast this week. Tom is an author, he's a speaker, he's a consultant who has authored or co authored 17 books, soon to be 18. Tom, I don't know how you do it, it's ridiculous. Uh, he is a keynote presenter, he's an in demand workshop presenter. He's been an educator for 38 years and has held almost every role that you can imagine. He's been a teacher, school-based administrator, district level leader, executive director, you name it. Tom's probably served in that role at some point in his career. But if you know Tom as well as I do, you will quickly come to know that the role Tom cherishes the most is the one of grandpa, because it is obvious to all who know Tom how proud he is of his grandchildren. So there are so many areas that we could explore with Tom today, and no doubt will be a reason why Tom returns to the podcast. But today we're going to focus on student behavior and school culture. So again, Tom, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks, Tom. It's a real treat to be here with you. And, I think we have an agreement that we won't share some of those stories that we do know about each other. They might not be fit for podcast content. I appreciate you providing all that background. Sometimes it reminds you that maybe it's just because I can't hold a job, or maybe it's the ADHD kicking in. I'm not quite sure, but it's a real treat and a real pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And I think it is one of those things where you just wear out your welcome sooner and sooner as your career moves on, right? And yes, we'll save those other stories for the director's cut that may or may not make an appearance on the podcast. All right, so let's dig into school culture, student behavior. Let's start with the biggest idea, and the biggest idea is that many teachers and principals. And to be clear, I obviously don't hold this position, but many teachers and principals might say, look, behavior is the job of families and parents. My job is to teach. Students should know how to behave when they don't. It's up to the families or the parents and caregivers to fix that. So talk first about why is it so important that schools be intentional and purposeful and proactive about student behavior?
Yeah, and I understand that mentality. And I think part of it's driven by because we have such limited time, and I need to have all that time on the academic targets, right? That gotta go, gotta go, gotta go, gotta go. And if that's the approach we're going to take, then what we are accepting on some levels is that the behaviors we are seeing are the very best ones that kids have. We're defaulting the instruction of those things to people outside of us, expecting that what you or I might value for our own children, everyone else should equally value. And so then that gets away from what we know is actually happening, whether it's troubles in the home, whether it's kids coming from broken families, whether it's a cultural perspective, whether it's an economic perspective, whether it's all those things. If we're willing to accept that they have learned it elsewhere, then we should just give up rushing to consequence. But that's what we seem to want to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
For me, it's the same as with academics. If you haven't taught it, why are you expecting them to know it? And so spare me the rhetoric, the myth that, they ought to know. A kid in grade 9 knows they shouldn't interrupt. A kid in grade 9 knows how they have to eat in the lunchroom.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're telling me then is you're going to ignore the evidence you have that Tom keeps calling out in class, and you're hoping that he knows. Mm-hmm. So then we rush to consequence. Listen, I think between the two of us, we've got 50, 60 years of education. I have yet to meet a kid who got consequence to better behavior. I'm not opposed.
Absolutely. Yeah. The rush to Tom, you bring up such a good point because, we tend to always respond to the negative, but we don't necessarily focus. Like if you're going to respond to the negative, then where is the response proactively, right? The idea of the taking that instructional and intentional approach.
Yeah, right. That notion, we say we're built on a foundation of responsibility. And you know what happens? 30 kids walk into class, 29 have done all the things that we defined as being responsible. One doesn't. And who gets our attention?
Right.
Every time it's the one. And in that moment, we have clearly indicated to every other kid, it's not about responsibility, because the thing kids want the most, your time, your attention, we have just given to the one kid who is behaving irresponsibly, thereby further entrenching. Look, I'm not opposed to consequence. Don't get me wrong. But consequence has to be paired with instruction if we are hoping for a breakthrough. You know, if it were consequence alone, prisons would go out of business.
Mm.
And yet we know the rate of recidivism is through the roof. Why? It's the same model we took once upon a time with our behavior programs. Put the most ill-behaved kids in a room together and tell them they better improve and wonder why they don't.
Right.
Well, we
Right.
know what happens. You're in there, I'm in there. We swap our bad ideas and we commit to an amalgamation of your bad idea and my bad idea if we ever get out of this place.
It's almost like we add to the toolbox. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a great idea. I never thought of that before. Now
Yeah.
you've given me
Right.
something more for my repertoire. You know, that's interesting. You brought up the point about, and you know, you and I have both talked about this for years, but how alluring adult attention is, and that when we are consequencing or in that mindset of consequencing, we may be inadvertently having the reverse effect.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it's
Right. You know, if I've been struggling with mathematics, a foundational skill, and I've struggled with that every year, all the way going back to my entry to school, kindergarten, and now I'm a kid in grade 5 or grade 6, and we're in math time. Look,
Mhm,
I believed 5 years of adults who told me I suck at math,
mhm.
but I need to have a certain cachet with my peers. So guess what I'm going to focus on?
Yeah.
I'm going to be, we're going to math. Good. I'm going to get kicked out. You think that's a consequence. I think it's a bonus. I
Mhm.
now don't have to do math. I got you off your game. My peers think I am awesome.
Yeah.
All
So you have
right.
that dueling reactions, right? So not only do I get to avoid math, but now my friends, my peers think I'm hilarious.
Oh, yeah. Right. Class clowns get standing ovations.
Yeah, it reminds me of the expression that time out only works when the time in environment is a positive or a desirable, right? That if you're not in an environment that you want to be in, that removing the student or what you perceive to be a consequence really ends up being a kind of reinforcement. And we're going to get to reinforcement in a moment, but I want to look at the bigger picture here, because one of your many excellent books, Tom, is the book 7 Keys to a Positive Learning Environment in Your Classroom. So let's start with those 7 keys, and maybe what are those 7 keys, and give us a quick sort of summary of why each of those keys is so important.
I just happen to have the book here with me,
Oh,
Tom.
do you?
Right?
Okay, that's good to know.
And so, we talk all about this whole notion of the 7 keys, and they certainly weren't meant to be that you must do them in order, but you must do them all if you're going to have that sort of functional classroom environment, right? And so it all begins with classroom expectations. That's key one.
Mhm.
And you'll note the emphasis on the word expectations. I am not a fan of rules. We
Mhm.
all know the old adage, rules are made to be, right, broken. We know
Broken.
that,
Yeah.
right? So we can all think of experiences where once we establish the rule, and by the way, when do we establish the rule? After a violation. We don't ever want to see that again. Now think about what we could end up then doing as educators. We could create a new rule every day, right? You know what happens? You used to live in a place where they had lots more snow. So did I. The
Mhm.
first time it snows, principal gets on the announcements, and what does the principal say? Don't
Don't
throw snow.
exactly.
What does every kid hear? Throw snow.
Throw snow.
They all come to the office. They all become schoolhouse lawyers.
Yeah.
I didn't throw it. I tossed it. I kicked it at the kid. I invited the kid over to the tree. I shook the tree, and the snow fell of its own free will. It was magical. I put a rock in it so it wasn't a snowball.
Mm.
I threw a slush ball, right? Why?
Yeah.
Because the rule was don't throw snow. Look, we
Mhm.
had an expectation of respect. What did respect mean? You didn't violate anybody's personal space. You didn't cause anything that caused them to feel hurt, unwelcome, not a part of our family.
Mhm.
I don't care how the snow got on that other kid. Were you the author of that? Right? What are you supposed to remember? Respectful. I shouldn't violate their space. I shouldn't do anything that causes them to feel hurt, unwelcome, not a part of our family. So
Mhm.
expectations are always the big kickoff, right? Then we get into targeted instruction. Once we agree on the expectations, who teaches them?
Yeah.
Short answer is every adult who intersects the life of that kid,
Hmm.
right? From our bus driver, through our custodian, through our front office staff, through our support staff, through the people from central office when they come, everybody is responsible for teaching our expectations.
Hmm.
We then get into the positive reinforcement. You and I, in our background, we both know at a minimum it's 4 positives to every negative to bring us back to balance. How do we work towards that?
Hmm.
We then get into data-driven decisions, a big chunk of the work we've both done, being evidence-based.
Right.
Data has got to stop being a bad 4-letter word in our profession.
Yeah.
It's become that, I think, simply because of how we use it. I've often shared this notion of we've got to stop using data as a hammer, rank and sort, and start using data as a flashlight, convert to evidence. What does the evidence tell us? We talk about differentiation and enrichment as key 6, right? Do we do what we need to do to ensure learning for all? It's a lovely 3 words that everybody says, oh yeah, I believe in. All right, well, what are you doing for the kids that aren't there yet? That
Right.
most important 3-letter word. What are you doing for the kids who already had it before you taught? Right? Differentiation, the word that's in there is different. Slower, louder is not different. It's not differentiation, it's humiliation.
Right.
Enrichment is not a volume proposition that we reward our best and brightest with more because then they stop being engaged.
Right.
And then, key 7 is just about collaboration. We know as strong as we have individuals in our profession, and I believe, by the way, we are blessed with the best adults ever in education. You become infinitely smarter when you work with others. That's the
Right.
strength of a team. You're a sports fanatic. I'm a sports fanatic. We know we
Yeah.
got teams that we cheer for. They got players at certain positions that are awesome. And then they get to the playoff round and they lose. How did they lose? Well, they came up against a
Yeah.
team that was committed to each other and to the cause
Yeah.
rather than their individual stats. So, in a nutshell,
Yeah.
that's the 7 keys.
Yeah. I want to pick up on a couple of things you mentioned there. First, I love the way you phrase the idea of a flashlight. I think the idea of database decisions, too often, and this is just a comment on my part, the idea that data people often see as just a spreadsheet or a graph, as opposed to thinking about an expansive definition of data being good information that helps inform the decisions we make going forward. And I love the idea, or that notion of the flashlight. But I want to sort of go back to expectations because as you were talking about the first key, it's making me think about, I want to maybe have you do a little think aloud here because we are clearly now since George Floyd and probably should have been sooner. But here we are where racial equity, cultural responsiveness is at the forefront, and we all need to be better at allyship. We all need to be better at what we do. So my question to you as a kind of think aloud is how do you see behavioral expectations uh, becoming more expansive in a school simply because if we look back, we think about what was good behavior in a school was often defined through a white Eurocentric lens. This is what it means to behave appropriately. And I'm recalling my conversation with Anthony Muhammad about, what different cultures accept as sort of their norms of behavior, if you will. So, how do you see schools being able to create expectations, but also being able to take an expansive view, a culturally responsive view to what those expectations actually are?
Yeah, and I think a good part of that cultural responsiveness is tied with that is this notion of cultural humility, right? Am I
Mhm.
willing to accept that I don't know everything? I know through my own lens as a 60-year-old white male who
Mhm.
grew up in. Now, I can share, that my youth was entirely negative, was all kinds of problems, but I still know that being white still afforded me a privilege that
Mhm.
someone in the same situation of color would not have had, right? I shudder to think. So now when we start to talk about in our school, and the model I really like to work on, Tom, is this notion of our house, right? Welcome to our house. I think as educators, we've got to stop lamenting about the houses kids come from and using those largely as a way to say why they can't learn, why they
Right.
can't progress, why they can't be on,
Yeah.
right? So welcome to our house.
Yeah.
We accept the responsibility for. So now we get to our expectations. If we, and you know this, oftentimes people land on the same expectations of respect, responsibility, safety.
For
All right, so
sure.
what does that look like in our house?
Mhm.
What do you bring to the table from your culture? We know in our country in particular, we've accepted lots and lots of kids from refugee camps.
Mhm.
But guess what respect looks like there?
Yeah.
Right? So where are we now? Where is it that we'd like to be? Do we commit to teaching? So let's say we tell kids, look, here's what respect looks like. One of the basic tenets of respect across any culture is when one person is talking, the rest of us are listening.
Mhm.
In many cultures, when the elder talks, it is dead silent out of deference to, regardless of what they're saying. It might not even be logical, right?
Right.
But so now here's how we're going to build out on respect. When one
Yeah.
person is talking, the rest of us are listening.
Yeah.
If there is a violation, we don't rush to consequence. We rush to teach.
Right.
Remember now what it looks like. Now I
Mhm.
get it. Look, it's much easier for me to yell at you when you yell out to tell you to stop yelling
That's right.
without recognizing the modeling I am doing, right? We've
That's
all
right.
seen that school where someone is yelling at a kid to use their inside voice and wondering why the kid is confused.
Yeah.
What did we teach? Now listen, Tom, what's the expectation we have here around respect? When
Mhm.
one person is talking, the rest of us, I get the kid might grumble it back to you,
Mhm.
right? And when you have something to share, what should you do? You should raise your hand. I know that takes more time. Good teaching takes time. Poor teaching takes even more time.
Mhm.
It's time spent in remediation, time spent in what I call chase time, trying to put the genie back in the bottle,
Mhm.
now consequencing you and wondering why. So, how do we get that cultural infusion into things like respect and responsibility? What does it look like? How do we integrate that into our schools?
Mhm.
We know in Canada, a lot of our, if we are talking about race relations, come with our Indigenous communities,
Yeah.
right? And we have done, as much as we sometimes like to snub our noses and say, you guys there ought to be better at. Uh, I'm not proud of how we have responded to our Indigenous community. I know we've got lots more work to do. And so, how do we infuse some of what they bring to the table into
Mhm.
that conversation, that welcoming of elders into the community, into the
Mhm.
conversation? What does respect look like there? What does responsibility look like there? What does safety look like there? So that we aren't getting to what you described earlier, that white Eurocentric view of this is what it looks like.
Mhm.
My son married an African American girl, and at the wedding it was awesome to see all of this coming together of unique experience, right? Of exuberance represented in a bunch of different ways. The way I celebrate is not the only way to celebrate.
Right.
Guess what, right? And
Mhm.
so I know having just come through the Christmas season, I know it's important to me because we celebrate Christmas.
Mhm.
But I can't be so naive as to think that in our schools today, we don't just have Christmas practitioners.
Right.
That's not me being down on Christmas. That's not me trying to ban Christmas.
Yeah.
Please, don't
Yeah.
send me the letters. That's
Yeah.
not what it's about. It's about recognizing that we don't just have white Eurocentric kids in the school anymore.
Right.
And I should honor what everybody brings to the table.
It's unfortunate that some folks will view the expansiveness of culture or cultural responsiveness as a zero sum game. That they view it as, it's that expression I've heard for years, which is when you've been on top for so long, equality feels like a loss,
Mhm.
and we really have to get ourselves out of that mindset. That as we add that level of cultural responsiveness to our schools, we're not taking away. You're not down on Christmas. You're expanding to be more inclusive and more responsive. So I think that's definitely something schools are already paying attention to, and something that I think, again, going back to my conversation with Anthony earlier in episodes 2 and 3, he said, there's nothing wrong with white culture. It's just not the only culture.
Exactly.
And that's exactly the point, is that we don't necessarily have to, you know, retract or diminish. It's more about expansion, and it's more about being open to the fact that appropriate ways of behaving have a lot of different ways of manifesting in different cultures. And I think being open, I love that notion as well that you mentioned about humility, the idea that we humble ourselves with the array of diversity that now exists in our schools.
What an
One
awesome
other, oh, go ahead.
what an awesome learning opportunity, right?
Right.
To be informed. You know, like you talked earlier about travel, right?
Hmm.
When I went to Kenya for the first time, what
Hmm.
an awesome learning opportunity.
Yeah,
I know nothing when I get to places like that.
that's right. That's
When I
right.
get a chance to work in our indigenous communities, I know nothing. I'm
Hmm.
open to, why wouldn't we crave that knowledge? And it
Yeah,
also ties back to some of the early stuff of Stephen Covey, right?
yeah,
The difference between the abundance mentality and the scarcity mentality,
right.
right? That scarcity mentality is what you alluded to earlier. There's only so much. And if I have to give up some of that to those people, then I lose,
Right.
rather than saying there is enough for all of us.
Right. Right. Yeah, absolutely. I want to pivot also to another one of the keys that you talk about, and that's positive reinforcement. You know, positive reinforcement seems to elicit polarized responses from people. You see this on social media, see this in other places. Some believe it's important. Some believe it's the very thing that undermines intrinsic motivation. Now, um, obviously, for you, positive reinforcement is one of the keys. So maybe just spend a few minutes expanding on its importance. Why is positive reinforcement, and talk about some of the important aspects that ensure that positive reinforcement doesn't devolve into this sort of distribution of tangible rewards.
Yeah, right. That everybody gets a trophy mentality, right?
Right.
You know, and I want to start with, preface my comments with this. Look, being positive doesn't guarantee a result, but being negative sure does.
Hmm.
I know what's going to happen if I operate only from a negative mentality,
Hmm.
right? Of an expectation that you'll get the message when you see how stern I can become. And listen, Tom, I'm embarrassed to say that's how I started my teaching career.
Yeah.
I believed that I had to be louder than anybody else. I had to find the kid who was the biggest problem and put them in their place, right?
Hmm.
Because that would let everybody know. And so I did. I had a loud voice. I still have a loud voice, right? And that's what I did. I used it as a weapon. When we talk about this positive reinforcement, it's not at that other extreme either of everybody gets a prize. We talk about being aware of what kids bring to the table, of some of the things they've experienced. Here's what we know: if we are trying to change behavior, it takes time. University College of London study that looked at how long it takes to establish a new behavior range from 28 to 254 days,
Wow.
longer than a school year. We know we have 254-day kids coming to our schools who have experienced way beyond trauma, that if we knew all the details, it would bring us to our knees
Hmm.
that they have survived this. So now how do we begin then to get to building a level of respect, right? How do we begin to get to appropriate language? Look, when I taught severe behavior, if I was going to send home the kids every time they dropped the F-bomb, my class would have been empty by about 8:30 every morning, right?
It's,
Were
it's
they
true.
always saying it out of anger? No, lots of times it was out of familiarity.
Hmm.
How do I want to teach you that there's other ways? I
Hmm.
began to record the kids, right? Hey, you know, you dropped the F bomb 3 times in that last 4 sentences, right? No, I didn't. Well, let's listen. Now, you notice the second time you used it very descriptively. I had never heard the word used in that way.
That's right.
What's a different word we might put in its place? Let's expand their vocabulary,
Yeah.
right? You know, think about this for yourselves. If you went to work every day and the only thing your boss, your leader noticed was what you were doing wrong,
Yeah.
would that help you to become better?
Hmm.
So, you know, the 4-to-1 ratio that we talk about in the book that you
Hmm.
know is popular for others is this notion that that's what it takes to get us back to normal. Now, I'm not suggesting that that means we got to be overt. What I am suggesting is for you to really examine the one, right? That's where I had to start. I had to question why my negatives were coming out. What were they intentional to? What were they aligned with? Was
Hmm.
I picking on only the kid who was irresponsible while telling the rest of the kids responsibility is important?
Right.
Once I began to focus on the one and question when it was coming out, it became easier then to say, hey, let's replace that with. because that negative, it sucks up a lot more time than any of the positives, right? So we had to start to rationalize that. Then it was to intentionally notice what is going on in an authentic way. Look, my best and brightest kids did not need me to be one of 8 teachers in the high school who gave them the report card canned comment, a diligent and resourceful student, a pleasure to have in class.
Right.
Equally important for those kids to get positive, authentic feedback.
Yeah.
The people that are sort of really opposed to any of this notion of positive. Alfie Cohn's one of the leading people, so we've got to stop rewarding kids. But even Alfie will suggest that when it is that the basic needs have been met, right? Kid who doesn't know how to be respectful in school, do you think if we just rush to consequence, they'll get there?
Right.
Or do we have to teach them? Do we have to start to build up? Do we have to start to notice? Look, some of your listeners are going to be the good morning people, right? I hope they are that way because it's authentic.
Yeah.
If you're not the good morning person, please don't force it, right? Put that fake smile on. It looks creepy to the kids, right? They wonder what's wrong with you because you got that, hey, good morning, children. It scares them.
Yeah. Yeah, for
What
sure.
else? Be true to you,
Mhm.
right? So now we start to build that out, that notion of being authentically positive.
Right.
You know what happens? It just becomes the culture, right?
Right.
Kids start to pick up on that. Listen, I don't mind if you borrow my pencils. I'd appreciate if you asked me.
Mhm.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, can I borrow your pencils? Yes. And when they return them, isn't that what we need? Don't we need to
Right.
have good civic discourse?
Mhm.
Right? The events of recent times are an indicator that we don't know how to disagree. We don't know how to respect that there could be a difference of opinion.
Right.
A healthy society needs a range of political viewpoints, I believe.
Mhm.
But I can't make you a sworn enemy of the state because you viewed something through a different lens,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, it's interesting that that notion of noticing, and I think that's where the conflating comes, where people often think about, they hear the word reinforcement and they imagine a teacher distributing M&Ms, or constantly just you know this thoughtless distribution of tangibles, as opposed to the idea, as soon as if you phrase reinforcement or positive reinforcement as positive feedback, it changes its connotation, doesn't it?
For sure.
Um, you in the book you wrote, and I'm going to quote you here. If teachers believe, quote, if teachers believe in success for all students, they must not relegate the harder, deeper, more meaningful work of cultural change and relationship building to the proverbial back burner. I could not agree more with that. So let's focus on relationship building now. So we've kind of talked about the macro, the 7 keys, positive reinforcement, expectations, et cetera. So let's get it down to the individual student level now. The vast majority of teachers know that building relationships is important. And I think the vast majority are striving to build positive relationships with their learners, but things can easily go sideways, right? We know that sometimes the riff in the relationship is actually sourced from the student. The student's not in the headspace, or they're unwilling to let their guard down and find common ground with the teacher, at least acutely. But often, we can't control that. But teachers and principals have a lot of control over what they do and how they engage with students. So, um, how do principals and teachers and even district leaders, how do we ensure the best possible opportunity to develop strong relationships with each and every individual student?
Yeah, and I think you've touched on it in the latter part of what you just shared there, Tom. One of the things we must do as the adults is to model what we expect, right? If we don't model what we expect, we should expect what we model. The eyes are on us always. So are you emotionally grounded as the adult before you begin to engage with the kid? Or do we have, even though we've called them expectations, they really are rules,
Mhm.
right? We have an expectation that school is litter free. And we walk by as adults, the paper on the floor, waiting for a kid so we can tell them to pick it up and remind them that we have an expectation of, right?
Yeah.
So are you emotionally grounded before you interact with the kid?
Mhm.
Right? Go back to the example earlier about raising your voice to tell kids not to raise their voice, right? Kids at the high school, you'll know this example well, who are trying to self-regulate. So they say it under their breath as they walk away, and the adult follows them. What did you say? What did you say? Do you really think you're solving some great mystery when they turn around and tell you? And by the way, since they're going to have to tell you that word, they might as well tell you 5 more because they already know consequence train is coming,
Right.
right? Are we grounded in that? Are we willing to not personalize every misbehavior? Do we recognize that sometimes kids wake up and mom and dad are in the midst of a fight, and the kid is then sent to school agitated, blames dad for the morning hullabaloo at home,
Mhm.
gets to school, and it's a male teacher who just says good morning, and the kid is still mad at dad? That teacher is dad, tells that teacher to F off.
Yeah.
Look, you don't have to own it, right? You know, that notion of you don't have to catch every ball thrown at you. Are you able to take a step back and say, wow, this is not normal? What am I
Mhm.
seeing now?
Mhm.
Because those are the moments. You will never teach a kid about respect by out disrespecting them.
Right.
That's when I'm not saying tolerate. Look, don't get me wrong. I don't think any teacher should have to put up with verbal abuse,
Mhm.
but you're not going to get there by engaging, right? This escalation doesn't produce a winner because you believe you're in the power position.
Right.
Right? The old Mark Twain analogy about never argue with a stupid person. They drag you down to their level, then beat you with experience. Right? We don't have to engage, but we want to because we think it's about power. Right? We think it's about who's in charge here, and we are going to make this kid the model of, and everybody else will learn. We're devaluing ourselves. I
Yeah.
believe, as you said at the outset, every educator is really focused on building strong, positive relationships.
Right.
So are you
Not
grounded now?
and not taking it so personal.
Yeah.
Personally, it's so, and it's so easy to do that. It's so easy because you're there and the student has said what they've said or done what they've done, and
Yeah.
it's really easy to take it personally. But as the only adults in the room, only one being paid,
Yeah.
here we are in that situation. I think most teachers, the vast majority, if not all teachers, are trying to build good relationships with their students, but it can easily go sideways. So,
Absolutely.
other ideas, Tom, other tips. How do we build a strong relationship with students over the long haul?
Yeah. And I want your listeners to write down these 8 words. I didn't say you had an attitude problem. 8 words.
Hmm.
Now, as you write them down, think about how that sentence is delivered if you emphasize each of the words.
Hmm.
So this notion of, are you conducting yourself? If I emphasize the I didn't say you had an attitude problem, it means somebody else said it. If I emphasize the didn't, it's just a straight denial. If I emphasize the say, maybe I wrote it down somewhere. If I emphasize
Right.
the you, it's somebody else. If I
Yeah.
emphasize the had, it's still evident, etc. Right?
Yeah.
So are we thinking about the message we're delivering? Is
Hmm.
that message then consistent with what we've said are the overarching expectations?
Hmm.
Are we as the adults now living those expectations? Please don't put anything on a wall or in a handbook that you as the adults are not prepared to model, and then we commit. So go back to my example of the good morning, and this kid never lifts his head and says good morning back, right? They just shuffle their feet with their head down and they go past. I need you as the adult to notice that moment
Yeah.
because it will happen. Even with 254-day kid, there will come a time where you will hear an almost inaudible grunt. Choose to believe that is the start of the turn. Choose to believe it was good morning. Celebrate the heck out of that. And the last part of this is, and we've got to be committed as a team. Look, 254-day kid is going to wear me out if I am trying to take that on individually. The single biggest cause of burnout, I think, in our profession is people thinking they have to go it alone. I need the team. I need to be able to tag off to my partner, Tom, who's going to take the next 30-day run at this kid. And we are going to, did you see anything yet? No, me neither. And we may have to bring in a third colleague or a fourth colleague. We may have to involve our school-based leadership, our school-based counseling support. But we are committed, because this is one of our kids in our house, that we are going to turn this around.
Right.
And I've been in schools where they are celebrating that they finally got 254-day kid.
Hmm.
right?
Absolutely. It's interesting that I didn't say you have an attitude problem. Reminds me that so much of what we communicate is not in the words we say, but in the paralanguage, in the body language, and all the tone, everything that surrounds it. It reminds me of something I often say to people, like how many of us have ever had a significant other utter the words "I'm fine," and you knew they weren't fine, right? So the words we say are not often. The true communication that we experience. Okay, let's finish up this part around school culture with this question, because I want to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit to school leaders. I know a lot of the listeners to the podcast are principals, assistant principals, district level leaders. So, what are some of the key messages you give to principals, assistant principals, et cetera, about how to go about prioritizing student behavior and student culture, or school culture, I should say? Like, where should they begin? Or if they're going to re-examine what's happening already, they've tried some things, maybe things went off track, how they've lost their way. Where should they begin, or what are some of the key things that leaders need to think about when it comes to student behavior?
Yeah. And the first part is to accept that this is a journey, right? It's not a checklist. You're not going to better at this overnight. So is it part of your core? Is it part of your purpose? When you talk about creating a positive learning environment, are you thinking currently of the kids who challenge that the most?
Mhm.
Because we know this, right? The kids who challenge us the most, they actually need us the most. Right? We also know they show up to school every day, and that just drives us batty. We'd love for them to catch the latest cold just so we could get a break from them, right? So this notion that we've got to be thinking about our commitment. Are we saying we want a positive learning environment? All right, what
Mhm.
does that look like? Are you, as the leader, then prepared to nurture and grow your team? I think when I became a principal, I had to remember I never stopped being a teacher. My kids were a little bit bigger, right? My staff, my faculty, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but I think the range of abilities and ability to get to, we had to be willing to teach.
Mhm.
It's a mistaken notion that a university degree in education prepares you to be a classroom teacher. I'm not sure if there's any other profession where the disconnect is as big as it is in our profession between, for the university response, the college response, making your 17-part lesson plan and getting to a class and never having a 17-part lesson plan because
Right.
reality sinks in,
Mhm.
right? So, what are your expectations around that? What have you built in then as opportunities to develop the skill set of your teachers? And then there's the context piece, right? You and I have both coached.
Yeah.
When you are coaching an elite level athlete, you can have different expectations. You can actually have a different tone of voice. When I was coaching, a volleyball team that ended up winning the provincial title, the equivalent of a state championship, I could ask those boys to do something different in practice than the, hey, here's our first time ever seeing volleyball group of kids, right? So we got to contextualize the instruction. Leaders, in the myriad of things they need to do, also need to be able to be a part of the dialogue. I know you can't be in every school meeting every time, but you've got to be in enough of the conversation around creating positive school culture that you can ask the value added questions, that you can take it a little bit deeper, that you know something about little Tommy in fourth grade and a bit of the background that you can contribute to the conversation, right? That when you have a teacher who has more referrals to the office than any other, you're not ranking and sorting that teacher. You're going and talking with that teacher and saying, so how can we help? What are some
Right.
of the things that are going on? Because others who have the same group of kids are not experiencing it. I'm willing to look, maybe it's because you get the kids after lunch every day. That may be a factor. Maybe it's the content piece. I'm willing to accept that. Maybe, but we've got to have the conversations, right? I
Right.
think as a high quality leader, and even as a high quality educator, you need to have two characteristics: courage to force up the tough issues, and vulnerability to accept that there may be a different path, a different response we can take in this situation with this kid, with this colleague.
I love that. I love the idea. It almost it seems to be an apparent, like a dichotomy, but it's not, right.
No.
It's the courage and the vulnerability. I think that's a great point, Tom. Tom, listen, this has been fantastic. as you know, that's the bulk of the interview, but I always end the interviews with a little bit of fun. I want to give people a chance to get to know you a little bit. So we're going to finish with a segment that I've kind of rebranded. It used to be 5 questions, but we're just going to keep it to 3 questions. So
I think
we'll
you've also
rebrand.
rebranded this as the most fearful part of the interview.
I like to scare people as to what is he going to ask me on this last part. But like I said, it's a chance to for listeners to get to know you a little bit on a more personal level. Nothing too intrusive, just some fun questions. So here's the first question. What's the one thing that's not work related? Can't be work related. What is the one thing that you love to do that you never seem to have enough time for?
That's a very good question. I love getting to sporting events, and I
Mhm.
still have on my list, to get to a high level college football game,
Mm,
right? Get to a high level, some of the American sports, right? That
yeah.
we don't get to see at the same thing here in Canada. So,
Mhm.
if I had more time, I'd love to just take, a 2 week trip to a tour of the big cities and watch the big events. I'm a big
Yeah.
hockey fan. I'd love to go on the original six tour and
Mhm.
visit those, right? So that would be something I think that would be really appealing.
Yeah. So for listeners, you don't know, Tom lives on the west coast of Canada, but is a massive Montreal Canadiens fan. And so this is where Tom and I take divergent paths as a diehard Vancouver Canucks fans. His team has had a lot more success than the Canucks. And I know Tom cheers for the Canucks when it's not the Montreal Canadiens. So, okay. Question 2. What band or type of music are most people surprised that you listen to, or that you like to listen to? Like, what music kind of surprises people? They go, "Wow, I didn't think you would like that type of music."
So this will date me because it's the era I grew in. But I'm a big Freddie Mercury fan and Queen fan, and in fact, that is my ticket to my longest standing relationship with my wife and I, coming up on our 40th anniversary. My ticket to success was to get her a ticket to the Queen concert. Once I
Mm.
did that, she was able to see past all of my very obvious faults because clearly I had something there. So if you catch me, imitating a Freddie Mercury falsetto, that might
Yeah,
throw a few people.
yeah. Well, it's interesting because Freddie Mercury, for me, is, and I talked a little bit about this, I think, with Bill Farrader, about the number one frontman of all time. And for me, it begins and ends with Freddie Mercury as the number one lead singer or frontman. So that's interesting. And certainly, you associating yourself with Freddie Mercury gave your wife a chance to see past all of those flaws.
Exactly.
Okay, last question, Tom, and take your time on this. If you had the power to invent a holiday, that one that we don't currently have, what would it be, and when would it occur?
Yeah, what would it be? Well, and again, I'll take it from a very selfish mode. I think we ought to have a national fishing day where I could just get out on a boat, with the appropriate liquid beverages in the place where there was guaranteed catch. And I got to tell you, I wouldn't even know that the day went by, because when I'm out on a boat catching fish, the hours would just slide by. In fact,
Mhm.
I think we, rather than just a day, we should make it a weekend, maybe
Okay.
a national weekend holiday, because I don't think there's such a thing as a national weekend holiday. So if we're going to have the ability to create, let's go all in.
Absolutely, right. And I think we can guarantee the beverages, but I'm not sure we can guarantee the catching.
No.
But absolutely, a fishing holiday. I love that. Okay,
Yeah.
even though I don't fish, I'll go along for the ride. Absolutely. Okay, Tom, as you know, I finish up every interview with the same question with all guests, and as what I'm trying to do with the podcast a little bit long term is thinking about success and happiness and where people find that in their lives, how they define it. So, as you've heard me ask many guests before, I want to finish up with this question: if a random person stopped you on the street and asked you, what is your definition of success? How would you answer them?
Give that some thought. I think the first thing for me when I think about success is I wake up every morning without dread about what I get to do, right? The work I get to do, the relationships I have, the connections. Every morning when I wake up is just I'm looking forward to the day, right? I don't have that. The second part of that is, for success, I want to be the person my grandbabies think I am, right? You know what it's like when no matter what happens for them, I'm just grandpa. That is the thing. They don't know if I've written 17 books or if I've written 17 sentences. That doesn't matter, right? They look at me, and so I want to be the person they think I am. That to me would be the ultimate definition of success.
I absolutely love that. That is such a that creates such a clear perspective and grounding on I want to be the person my grandkids think I am. That's I think a fantastic way to finish up today. Tom, again, I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today. Listeners, really would encourage you to follow Tom on Twitter. Tom has a great Twitter feed, lots of great content, lots of deep thinking around education on a number of different topics. His Twitter handle is at @Hierck. So that's the Twitter handle. And I would also encourage you to spend a bit of time on Tom's website, www.tomhierck.com. You'll see Tom's publications. You'll see Tom's blogs. Tom also blogs at the allthingsassessment.info website that I've mentioned in previous episodes with Cassandra and Nicole and Katie White, et cetera. But Tom has his own blog spot as well that you can find a lot of content there for Tom. And you can also find Tom on LinkedIn and Facebook. Just search Tom's name, Tom Hierck, on LinkedIn and Facebook. So I'd encourage you to do that. You won't be sorry to follow Tom, and especially the Twitter feed. I think there's some really great content there. So Tom, thanks again for being here, and I look forward to next time.
Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks.